We're going to carry on today from the book of Acts, starting chapter 25, starting in verse 1, where it says, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. So after spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day, he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. And when Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Okay, a couple quick things, because I'm sure many of you have questions like, who is Festus? If you haven't been with us, or even if you were with us, it was just kind of a last-minute addition at the end of chapter 24, where it mentioned that Felix, the previous governor, he was on his way out, right? He held Paul for 2 years. He detained him for 2 years and kept him in jail, and all the while waiting for a bribe. But at the very end, it said, then his time came up, and a new governor came, and his last name was Festus. And so that is who we're reading about right here. He's the new governor in town. He's the new guy. And can you believe it? Poor Paul has been detained for 2 years on the same charge that they don't really know. In fact, we know that Felix said there was no evidence, there was no reason to hold him. Why did Felix hold on to him? Because Felix wanted a bribe, right? That's who Felix was, and that's what he wanted. But as Festus arrives, he hears about Paul, he hears about this case. He's in Jerusalem first, and he hears about it from the Jewish leaders. And so can you imagine, right? You're new on the job, you're brand new in this committee, and all of a sudden you're asked to sit in judgment over someone, and they're telling you how heinous and horrible this person is. He deserves death. He's just causing a stir, and he's like, wow, this guy Paul, he's a real problem. And so what's he do? He says, you know what? We need to deal with this right away. And so immediately he heads back to Caesarea and immediately holds court once again. He's like, we got to solve this. This has been going on too long. Not only that, if you remember, he is the brand new governor over what is called Palestine at that time. It's the province of Palestine in the Roman Empire. And so his main driving force is to keep peace, right? It said he wanted to do it as a favor to them. Why would you want to do a favor for the people? Because he wants the people to like him, so it makes it easier for him to keep peace. It makes sense. And so in verse 8, it says they come forward, they make all these charges, they can't prove them. And then in verse 8, it says, then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, then no one has the right to hand me over to them. So I appeal to Caesar. After Festus has conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. See, Paul understands that this is not, number one, the first time that they've plotted against him. If you remember, the whole reason that Paul gets sent to Caesarea was because of a plot to kill him while he was in Jerusalem. They were going to try and ambush him while he was on the way to court, and they had to send him with 200 soldiers out to Caesarea for his own protection. He has been detained in Caesarea because then that way, where there's a larger concentration of Roman forces, the Jews weren't likely to try and attack him. That's why they wanted him to be retransferred back to Jerusalem where they could get him on the road while it was easier. And of course, they're hoping after 2 years and a new governor, maybe they won't realize how much danger Paul is really in. But Paul knows what's going on. Paul understands. And Paul is also doing a great demonstration of the fruits of the Spirit in this particular instance. Can you imagine yourself wrongfully accused, being detained for 2 years. And Paul doesn't cry out. Paul doesn't get mad at God. Paul doesn't even get mad at the authorities. Paul is saying, you know what? I'm going to be patient in the Lord. I'm going to be here because this is where the Lord wants me to be. How difficult must that be? But this is why we need to, again, look at it as a virtue that we cultivate, a virtue that we nurture, something that grows in us, and not necessarily just some sort of spontaneous gift that just pops into our life. This is something that takes time. Do you think Paul was always that way? In fact, we can look at earlier in the book of Acts and realize he wasn't, right? Especially when he was Saul. He was not patient. He was not kind. He was not loving, and yet all these things grew over time. He allowed the fruits of the Spirit to come into his life. But Paul also recognizes that his life is in danger once again. So he makes this appeal to Caesar, the highest court in the land, which is, of course, his right because he is a citizen of Rome. And in verse 13, it says that a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked him to be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they face their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. And when they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute about him and with him about their own religion, about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar." Okay, a couple quick things. Number one, who's King Agrippa? Right, all of a sudden we have this king show up out of nowhere, and I thought Caesar was king, and that's, of course, if you remember King Herod, the way that King Herod kind of harangued himself in there, he was able to make sure that there was a royal lineage for the Jews. And if one of the things, it's not, we don't have it in our canon, in our Bible, in the Bible that each one of us has here and is in the rows here in the chairs. If you get some of the apocryphal books, it's some of the extra books. The Catholics actually have this as part of their Bible. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees covers this period of time when Rome finally shows up in the early occupation of Palestine, when the Roman Empire is expanding and they finally get to Jerusalem and they throw out the Persians. Sorry, the Macedonians at that point, because it was the Persians, then the Macedonians came, conquered that under Alexander the Great, and then Rome came in after that. And one of the things about the Jews is that they are very strong in their belief and their conviction. Especially, right, they're so committed to the law and to Torah that they would not yield to this other authority. Rebellion after rebellion after rebellion kept popping up. And one of the most notable one is the one that's written about in 1st, 2nd, 3rd Maccabees, which is the Maccabean rebellion, which, by the way, is where modern-day Jews get Hanukkah from, is from that rebellion, where God provided for them as they held out against the assault on the fortress. With all this chaos and all this disruption constantly going on, the Romans were just so beside themselves. How do we do it? And Herod was able to convince them, hey, if you make me king over the Israelites, they'll calm down. And it worked. It worked for the longest time. They finally had peace, and it's not until 70 A.D., which is going to be a few years after this, it's not until 70 A.D. that there's another huge riot that ends up making Israel completely collapse, and the temple gets destroyed. So King Agrippa, he shows up with his queen, and Festus is telling him this stuff because he's like, okay, I need to get in with, the movers and shakers, right? We've all been there. You start a new job, you're in a new position, you got to find out, okay, who are the people that actually have control? Who are the people that actually have power? I need to get in and understand who they are and, make good relationships with them so that my life will go easy. And that's exactly what Festus is doing here. And what's incredible about this is actually Festus's very objective take on what's going on with Paul. Right? He heard all these terrible things being said about Paul and about how Paul had to be condemned to death. And so there, he's kind of wondering to himself, what on earth am I supposed to do with this guy? This guy, Paul, who's caused all these people to be bloodthirsty and want him to die. Like, what am I supposed to do with him? And he brings him up to King Agrippa. King Agrippa hears him, and we're going to read in the next verse that he wants to hear it for himself as well, because he's fairly new to the throne as well. But one of the things that I noticed about this is it's funny. Normally when we're going through the book of Acts, we're learning a lot from Paul, and we do see good fruits of the Spirit from Paul. But one of the things that I love about this is one of the things that we can learn from Festus in this particular instance, a Roman citizen, a Roman governor. And that is his dedication and his passion and conviction to go after the truth and to not compromise that truth for anything. See, when we read about Felix before, Felix was willing to compromise the truth. He knew what the truth was. He knew Paul was innocent. He knew he should release him. But instead, he kept him in captivity. Why? Because he wanted a bribe. He was corrupt. Festus, on the other hand, he shows us someone of good moral standing, someone who doesn't necessarily have to be a follower of the way. Why? Because God writ the law of the land on each and every one of our hearts, right? It's one of those arguments that maybe you've had with people, maybe you've seen other people have with others, where you'll argue with an atheist about where does morality come from? Because where does morality come from? People will say, well, you can determine morality through science. No, you can't. Well, we find what's collectively the best for you. Well, what was best for one group is not best for the other. Where does morality come from? And the fact of the matter is, I'm not saying that people who don't believe in God aren't moral. I'm saying that I believe in a God who wrote the moral law in each and every one of our hearts. And so whether you want to admit it or not, there's a reason why each and every one of us has that conviction in our heart. There's a reason why we know that what we do is wrong. There's a reason why we have these, our conscience draw so strongly on each and every one of us. And so when Festus is going through this, what I'm seeing is the work of God, much like how God worked with Pharaoh, much like how God worked with the king of Babylon and with the king of Persia. God doesn't just work with those who believe in him. He will use whoever is at his disposal in order to make sure that his will be done. And we see Festus here being an exemplar of truth and justice, and how the truth matters. Verse 22, then King Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. So the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered, what a great word, pomp. Came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officials and prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not live any longer. But I found he had done nothing to deserve death, and because he made this appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner to Rome without specifying the charges against him. How reasonable is that, right? Can you imagine that? The people are angry, they're fuming, they're crazy, they're absolutely mad with rage. And he has to make this appeal to Caesar, and he's like, I don't know what to do, but how on earth can I send him to the most powerful man in the land and go, yeah, I don't really know why. I think he's innocent. I don't really know why, but they want to kill him. How do you do that? That's crazy. I can understand poor Festus. He's really torn here because on one hand, he wants to maintain order. He wants to maintain civility. He wants the province of Palestine, which, by the way, was named Palestine by the Romans because of how rebellious the Israelites were. They were so rebellious that they said, oh, I know how we'll get at you. We're going to call Israel Palestine. By the way, if you didn't know, that's the history of that. That's how that came to be. And here's poor Festus. He's just trying to make it work. He doesn't want people to die, but he's also not willing to bend the knee to a lie. He's not willing to compromise what he believes. He's not willing to compromise his morals in order to say, you know what? In order to appease the mob, I will lie. He's not willing to do that. He's trying to find any relief for himself that he can, but he will not give up the truth. He's absolutely torn. Right? Because he knows if he releases Paul, there's going to be a riot. They're going to start burning down the city. They're going to be angry. But much like Pontius Pilate before him, I think he understands that I can't just condemn an innocent man. Now, Pontius Pilate, on the other hand, I don't care if he washed his hands beforehand. The Jews didn't have any authority to crucify Jesus, so it was on him. Okay, he did it. He made the order. Festus doesn't want to do that. He's like, I'm not willing to compromise what I believe. He is a man of conviction. He's a man who is passionate about getting to the truth and only serving the truth. The pursuit of truth and justice is absolutely paramount. Right? This is something not just that a Roman official has. This is something that Jesus taught us ourselves, right? He taught each and every one of us. God teaches us in his word that going after the truth, following that conviction, and only serving the truth is the only way forward. I look at Festus and I see a man absolutely driven by principle and morality, and I go, yes, that's what I'd want to be. We're not seeing a perfect man, right? Let's be clear. He's not perfect. But that conviction, that's something to aspire to. To allow that level of conviction to allow you to not bend, to not break at all, but instead stay strong in his pursuit of truth and justice. See, here's the thing. And it's one of those things that I've been thinking a lot about, right? Because people say this all the time. They'll say, well, science and religion are opposing forces. And I say, well, no, that's absolutely ridiculous. In fact, you can't even have science without at least a foundation of religion. And if you think that's crazy, let me tell you why. See, here's the thing. Religion makes a statement, and a moral statement. It says, this is what ought be, right? Morality is the ought statement. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm saying, it's like, it's not that, or it's you should not kill someone. You ought not kill somebody, right? That is a bad thing. What science does is examines what is. People do kill people. Does that make it good or wrong, or good or bad? It doesn't matter because science is amoral. It doesn't have morality. You can't get morals from science. That's why they're not in competition, but they're in collaboration. They work together. In fact, the very foundation of science was religion, because unless you believe that there's some sort of objective truth out there, unless you believe that there is some sort of absolute, something to seek and something to find, then there is no science. You can't find something that isn't there. You can't seek after something that isn't there. You need to have that foundational religious belief first. I'll give you a great example. You ever heard of postmodernism? This is a doozy. I still don't understand how it ever got taken seriously and why it's still around. It is finally fading off, thank goodness, but it's ridiculous because here's the thing. Hey, if truth is relative, which is the claim, then just think about how ridiculous this is, and I'm going to paint it real clear for you. That means if truth is relative, which means just because it's true for you doesn't mean it's true for me. Can you imagine making that same statement about gravity? Well, no, gravity is true for you, but not for me. I can fly. Come on. That's ridiculous. Everyone knows that's ridiculous. Here's the thing. At the core of our being, each and every one of us knows that there is truth. It is absolute, it is singular, and it is discoverable. It's something that we can find, something we can seek after, something we can apply ourselves to, and something that we can go after. Not only is there truth, but there's justice. See, truth is something that we can find through science. We can find the thing. But even if we find the truth, it doesn't tell us what ought to be. So how can you have justice without morality? It's funny, have you guys ever heard this? And I think it's ridiculous. And they'll say, we don't want laws based on morality. Has anyone ever heard that? It's the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard in my life. Give me a scientific reason why you shouldn't murder. There's no ought. There's no ought. You can tell me, you can give me certain stats, you can give me numbers and stuff like that, but it doesn't tell me what you should or shouldn't do. All law is based on morality. All law tells us what we ought to do. Because again, these two things, truth and justice, these two things that are absolutely paramount in our life, these things that are absolutely paramount in this story, they coexist. And they need to coexist together. See, we can't get justice without seeking after the truth. And if there is no truth, then there's no such thing as justice. We need to have both. There's nothing wrong with looking at the two together. See, Festus knows, and he's learning about his commitment to his principles, right? He knows that he knows what he believes in. He's unwilling to compromise, even if it means he's going to have an angry mob. Because although there have been signs of corruption throughout the Roman Empire up until this point, it doesn't mean that there aren't those who follow that conviction that God has placed on their heart. See, once morals reign, instead of some social status of virtue, we begin to see goodness. Think about it. People often refer to different areas, different times, and different periods as golden ages in their particular societies. We know, like if we look at Israel, for example, the golden age of Israel was under the reign of King David. And a lot of people will look at the wealth and the status and the power that King David had and say, aha, that's it. But what about the morality? See, I think the reason that Israel rose to such prominence, Israel rose to such power and such authority is because they were a people who realized we cannot compromise, we cannot bend. When David was guilty, he paid for it. When David wronged the Lord, he was judged. But he was a man after God's own heart, who sought after God and went after the things of God. I think sometimes even without even knowing it, even if you're a Roman official, if we follow that conviction of the Holy Spirit on our heart, because God made a way, then we too can find ourselves living good. See, how do we live with all this? How do we deal with all this? What do we do with all this scripture? What do we do with this story? First thing I want to ask you is, what do you believe in? And I don't just mean, do you believe in God? In fact, I think that's a ridiculous question. I tell my friends this all the time, especially my friends that are atheists. I said, this is a ridiculous question. Okay? Is there such thing as God? If you don't have God, you don't have morality, you don't have truth, you don't have justice, you don't have any of this. You can't make any claims of these kinds. And of course, they get upset. They'll say things like, well, are you saying I'm immoral? I'm saying, no, I believe you're moral because God exists and God wrote it on your heart. But what do you believe in? What kind of convictions do you have in your heart? What are the things that you know that you ought to do, and what are the things that you know you ought to avoid? You need to spend some time with yourself thinking about it, going over the Word. Do you trust that the Holy Spirit will inform your conscience? Because here's the thing. We don't just read about it in the book of Acts. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 26, this is a very famous quote. I'm sure you've heard it many, many times. But it says this, eventually. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? See, here's the thing. When we compromise our beliefs, when we compromise our convictions, I'm sure you've heard it said before, we call that someone selling their soul. You gave up the core of your being, the very essence of who you are, for what? for a little temporary pleasure, temporary status. Many of us probably know people that have done this very thing. And one of the things that we all know, they're hollow. And they know it. Why do you think there's been such a massive resurgence of all, like, I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to this, but it's actually been something that's been giving me so much hope, is I've been seeing just wave after wave and just tons of young people even that are seeking after Jesus Christ because they're going, there is something wrong with this world and Jesus is the answer. There is a revival going on right now. Because they recognize, you know what? All of these things that we've been chasing for all this time, for the last century of chasing after pleasure and status and wealth and fame, none of this is fulfilling. In fact, it's amazing when they do the happiness studies that some of the happiest places on earth are some of the poorest regions of the world. Because it's not about wealth and fame and status. Those things make life easier, but it doesn't make you happy. It doesn't give you joy. It doesn't give you love and peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. It doesn't give you the fruits of the Spirit. And here's the thing. Let's not forget the last half of verse 26 here. What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Here's the thing. Once you sell your soul, how can you afford to get it back? Once it's gone, it's gone. But praise God that Jesus gave us a way to redeem it. That none of us are too far gone. None of us, no matter what we've done, no matter where we've been. Jesus says, look, if you're sincere, if you're really repentant, I want you back. And why? We need to trust Him. We need to trust His word, trust His ways, trust His plan. And for what reason? Why do we follow the law? Why do we look at the Bible? Why do we examine what was going on back then? Why do we do all this if it's a new covenant and we get saved by grace? Why do we do all these things? Because as the Bible tells us in the book of Deuteronomy, that it might go well for you in the land I'm about to give you. Here's the thing, the kingdom of heaven is still over the horizon. But we can see it, we can get a glimpse of it. But we need to prepare now. I love that parable about the farmers who were preparing for rain, right? One farmer went and prayed for rain and then went and sat around, and the other farmer went and prayed for rain and then he went out and he prepared his fields to receive. Which one are you? Are you the farmer that's just hoping to press the buttons and just get God to give you what you want? Or are you the one that's going to say, you know what? I believe that God's going to do things and I'm going to go out and prepare, get my life in order, get my life together, do the things that I need to do in order to prepare myself for the oncoming kingdom of heaven that is just over the horizon. So let's prepare ourselves, question our own beliefs, ask ourselves what convictions we have, and are we following them? Are we allowing the Holy Spirit to lead us and to guide us?